Lessons learned from industry transformations in healthcare, automotive, neuroscience, and theme park design have captured the attention of those in the capital projects industry. It implores us to ask, how can we increase productivity in capital projects? In this presentation, you will gain insights to paths industry leaders should prioritize to increase productivity by applying innovations found beyond the current methods. Here to share with you their findings, please welcome Paul Goodrum, Shannon Hopkins,
Thank you. Much has been discussed regarding the trends in construction productivity. And regardless of what perspective you share, whether construction productivity has been improving or declining, I think we can all agree that we can be doing better. My name is Paul Goodrum. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm joined today by my colleague, Shannon Hopkins, who's also the research co-chair for DCC-01. It was our pleasure today to share with you the lessons learned and the knowledge about how other industries are transforming their processes to improve their performance so that we may also improve our performance in construction. Now, this certainly is not the first CII research project that's ever focused on productivity. Actually, if I would argue, if you look at most of the historical projects in productivity in the industry, a lot of it has occurred within CII. And a lot of the CII research has always had an underlying current about improving productivity in one way or another. But when you look at the projects that directly address productivity in construction within CII, it goes back to the start of CII from the very beginnings. And most of these projects, all the projects I would say, were very successful at capturing industry best practices to better plan and control to improve construction productivity. And while there are still likely industry best practices that still need to be mastered in construction, for example, advanced work packaging to advance its implementation, in order to significantly grow to improve construction productivity, we need to start looking outside our industry to find out what other industries are doing that we can adopt to create an aggressive research agenda for CII. Now, one of the things I like to do is do a little bit of interaction. And normally when you're teaching a class or you're giving a presentation, you don't like to see the smartphones come out. But in this case, I would love you, if you could, take out your smartphones, and hopefully by now you've had a chance to download the application that Noah and others have been talking about. And if you go to today's schedule, you'll see a series of the presentations, and we're at the presentation scheduled at 2:50 p.m. And if you open up that session, you'll see that we have two polls that we're going to ask, two questions. Question number one is poll number one. We have a second poll, but we're going to answer the questions one at a time. And so hopefully, some of you may have already started answering poll number one. What the question is really looking at is, most of you that are here today, and I think for all of you actually, and for your companies, you're making a significant investment to improve productivity. And there are many ways, techniques about how you can improve productivity. So if you can, start answering the question now if you've had a chance to access the polling, because the options are varied. Are you, as a company, investing most of your resources to improve construction productivity through new technologies? We've heard a lot about that already at the conference, through robotics, automation, and integration information systems. Are you looking at adopting new construction methods, modularization, prefabrication as an example? Or are you looking at new approaches to human resource management? For example, improving the recruitment, the training, and the retention of qualified craft workers. Okay. So let's see if we've got any results. I didn't see any results on that. If I can, let's just raise your hand. How many of you, for the most part, look at new technologies? Okay. How about new construction methods? How about new approaches to human resource management? By and large, I don't think there's one single silver bullet about how industries are improving their industry performance. What we've seen and what we've learned in this research team is that the way different industries are improving their performance vary by the industries themselves. So for example, in the healthcare industry, a mistake can lead to what's known as a serious safety event. In the case of pediatric care, a serious safety event means that a child either receives permanent harm as a result of the medical care they receive, or in extreme cases, death. Fortunately, in the industry, we've seen a significant reductions in serious safety events happening in the pediatric medicine field. And a lot of this is due to two factors. One has been a traumatic change in culture, as well as technologies. So for example, when a serious safety event does occur, every decision, every event, every action leading up to that serious safety event is looked at with the sole purpose of finding out how to not repeat that serious safety event in future cases. What we're also seeing happen in the pediatric field is that highly integrated and automated information systems that are also benefiting from the use of artificial intelligence. So when a medical provider prescribes medical treatment for a child, he or she will receive a notification if the system detects the prescribed medical treatment may be incompatible with the child's conditions. Maybe there's a known allergy documented in the system that the medical care provider does not know. Or maybe there's other medications that the individuals may be receiving that's unknown to the medical provider. The systems are designed to create a pop-up to allow the medical care provider to confirm if this is a treatment they want to provide. If they do, they can continue going forward. These cases, these lessons learned in terms of how an industry is looking at their culture and technology to reduce their mistakes, their errors, can seed new research in how we as an industry, for example, might reduce construction rework. Computer interfaces with the human brain used to be the stuff of science fiction. But now with breakthroughs in neuroscience, those dreams are becoming closer to reality. When our team interviewed experts in the field of neuroscience, we learned that the field is making huge strides in decoding mysteries of the human brain. How do they do this? A lot of it has been due to data standards and data pooling. So for example, when you walk into a hospital or someone you know walks into a hospital and receives an MRI, the data that's collected from that MRI is collected due to standards that's been just prescribed by the National Institute of Health. That data is obviously then used by the hospital to prescribe medical care if it's necessary. But also, that data is then shared with researchers not just in the US, but throughout the world. Neuroscientists today now have access to vast amounts of data that they never had access to before, but not just big data, but also very consistent data. And it's been that vast, consistent data sets that allow them to begin to decode the human brain that leads to breakthroughs that's happening both in technologies and medical treatments. Traditionally, when we look at our own industry, we oftentimes, when we collect data, for example, with CII, and when I've collected CII data for 26 years, I oftentimes see how research teams collect data in very unique ways. I oftentimes see how companies collect data, especially related to productivity and rework, in their own unique ways and keep it very proprietary. By doing so, that really limits about how we use that data for future purposes. I know talking about data standards and data coding is not a sexy topic, but what we have seen is that other industries are using that as a first step to really develop the science that leads to developing technological breakthroughs. Our Team DCC-01, we interviewed the technical lead for engine design for a major automobile manufacturer. His challenge is not to create a more powerful engine. That's actually easy. The challenge for the company is to create more fuel-efficient engines that also have less emissions. So as a case in point, the air that comes out of the engine in many parts of the world is cleaner than the air that goes into it. And how do they do that? Traditionally, with engine design and automotive, each individual component was designed in isolation. So in this case, the engine designer would design an engine, not necessarily thinking about how the changes in the engine would affect the transmission or the drivetrain, for example. That has tremendously changed over the past couple of years. Now, in terms of design of modern automobiles, it's a systems approach that's used in design. So when the engine designer looks at designing changes of the engine, they're immediately asking themselves, how is this change going to impact the transmission? How is this change going to impact the drivetrain, for example? And a lot of this has been made possible by advanced simulations that allow the engine design companies and automobile manufacturers to look at how different components impact the overall performance of the automobile as a system. For example, in construction, how often when we look at change in a construction process on a project, are we asking ourselves how that change might affect the downstream operations on a project? So for example, if a company was to look at adopting and implementing a new material tracking system, do we oftentimes ask ourselves how the processes and operations downstream will be able to take advantage of increased availability of materials on the project? I know we oftentimes look at theme parks and arcades as a source of entertainment and opportunities for escapism. But when you actually look at all the service industries in the United States today, the most productive service industries are theme parks. And how are they doing this? We talked to a design engineer for a leading theme park company, and one thing we learned is widely adoptions of integrated and automation information systems. So for example, with one theme park company, before you even leave your home, you're sent a wristband with an RFID chip. From the moment you arrive at the airport, the RFID chip helps to direct you to which bus to take to the theme park. You can then bypass the check-in desk, the front desk of the hotel, go directly to your hotel room. You can then drop your luggage, go to the theme park, use that same wristband to buy food, make reservations on rides and evening entertainment. It used to be that a lot of theme parks closed down one day a week. The industry has also been known for their advanced control systems on rides. So if a ride is requiring maintenance, these control systems alert that. If they break down, the control systems also help provide self-diagnostics to get the rides back up and running faster. I know that as an industry, we've also been widely adopting of RFID systems and integration and automated systems. But what we're simply seeing is other industries have eclipsed us in terms of their level of adoption and implementation. So these are the sample of the industries that participated both in our workshops and interviews with the intent of developing a new research slate to improve construction productivity. So our research team was charged by the CII Downstream and Chemical Sectors Committee to develop a research roadmap that, if it was implemented, would lead to significant improvements in construction productivity. We followed a scientific process over the span of 1 year that identified and rated a series of topics based on their ability to not only improve productivity, but also the feasibility to implement these topics and develop these topics to the typical type of resources you expect through a CII research program. The topics were identified through a series of interviews and workshops, involved participants both within our construction industry, but more importantly, we stepped out and talked to experts in other industries to learn how they're dramatically improving their processes and their productivity as well. In total, the research developed 29 different research topics that were candidates for a research roadmap. Now, it's not feasible for CII or almost any funding agency that I know of to implement all 29 research projects. So to prioritize the topics, we use a process called the Delphi Method, which balances broad and creative thinking with critical discussion, and also, most importantly, consensus. Once all the topics were researched, we prioritized the topics based on 4 metrics. One was the ability to improve direct work, times on tools. Next was the ability to improve unit rates, output per work hour. Then we also looked at the feasibility to research and develop it. So we weren't looking at tractor beams or levitations with mind control, for example. That would be typically outside the realm of CII or most other funding agencies, so we had to think about stuff that could be researched. But then also the feasibility to implement it on projects. Normally, the Delphi process, if you're not familiar with the research method, requires 6 to 7 months to use the research method, because oftentimes it's based on paper surveys and having to redo it through a series of rounds of interviews. But for this case, we were a pretty accelerated one-year project, so we actually developed an automated application that allows us to complete the Delphi process in 1.5 days, which is in many ways a research innovation in and of itself. So ultimately, we developed a ranking of the topics. And the top 10 are shown here. Now, you don't necessarily have to be jotting all this down. I'm happy to say that the report is available through the application, so that you're more than welcome to go through there and read more about these topics, but also all 29 topics that we identified in our projects. Now, I will say this. Throughout our process, we were cognizant about avoiding our own bias to favor different types of topics. And actually, we did observe that participants that, both in our workshops and interviews, they did have a level of bias based on their familiarity with the topic. So for example, by now we probably have all heard about artificial intelligence. And if you're not quite sure what artificial intelligence is, if you're sending a text or sending an email, and the system starts to autocomplete your words and autocomplete your sentences, that is a form of artificial intelligence. But how many of us have sat down and thought about, well, how do I develop artificial intelligence applications specifically to use on my projects? And sure enough, what we saw in the data is that we did see a strong correlation with our participants' familiarity with the topic, and also how feasible they felt the topic was to research and implement. So accordingly, we adjusted the feasibility scores as part of the index based on a familiarity index. So as shown, this allowed us to develop the topics and begin to prioritize them based on both their potential impact to improve productivity, as shown on the y-axis, and also the feasibility to implement and develop the topics. Now, there's a lot of ways we can kind of look at all these different topics and slice them up into different research roadmaps requiring different resources and durations. But for today, we're just going to look at a slate of 5 research topics that had the highest combined impact in terms of on productivity, but also the highest feasibility scores in order to research and develop these projects within the next 5 years. So to begin presenting the topics of the research roadmap, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Mr. Shannon Hopkins with Eastman Chemical.
Thank you, Paul. Well, good afternoon. My name is Shannon Hopkins, as Paul had said earlier, and I've been in the industry now for a little over 29 years working for Eastman Chemical in the engineering and construction world. Before we get started, there's probably a couple of things we need to get through. One is you've probably heard the more elegant and certainly the more educated side of this presentation than Mr. Goodrum there, my good friend. Secondly, I'm in a suit and tie. And the last time I did this presentation, I had pointed ears and a Leonard Nimoy cut and black spandex. So I'm very appreciative of the fact I'm in a suit, but the suit on me is like lipstick on a pig. It doesn't really improve the overall look because at the end of the day, it's still just a pig. Thirdly, I understand where we're at in time. It's in the afternoon, it's a 3 o'clock slump. I understand there's a reception afterwards, and I'm the one of the 2 or the 3 people left today. There's in between you and a cold beer. And so I'll try to get us through this presentation as quickly as possible this way, because cold beer to me, I'm from Texas, that's one word, and it's a staple in dinner every night. So we'll get through it together, one way or the other. So our first map, I just want to take you through just the road map that this team developed. This is just the old construction guy talking here. I'd take this suit and jacket off if there wasn't a tire requirement. So anyhow, our first stop is increasing the use of advanced work packaging. There's no doubt the research over a number of years has proven that advanced work packaging does improve craft productivity. However, what this research team found is that it has very limited use in the downstream sector, in the chemical sector. Now, advanced work packaging became a CII best practice in 2015, but what we found is that there's a number of barriers that limit the implementation of advanced work packaging. This team that we're proposing would have to investigate those barriers. What are such as its scalability? Is it management buy-in? Is it cost to implement? Is it technology adoption? Or is it simply, as we heard earlier from Art, is it something changed? Is it something new? I had the opportunity to talk with Art at breakfast this morning. I think I've been psychoanalyzed. I'm not really sure exactly where we wound up after that conversation. But the thing that was important to his conversation was that implementation of change. So this team is really challenged with how can projects and our companies overcome those barriers. The good news is this team was actually established in the fall of 2018 by the downstream sector and has been kicked off and are currently underway. Our second stop on the roadmap is providing the right information at the right time and format. Now, over the past 3 decades, we have seen in a construction workforce, that's the wrong notes, by the way. Anyhow, we've seen the advancement of 3D modeling and implementation of digitized engineering deliverables. There's no doubt that those engineering deliverables in a digitized format increase the efficiency of productivity or increase the efficiency of craft workers in the field, but there's more to it. How can augmented reality, we saw an augmented reality presentation earlier today, how can that reality be used to improve both efficiency for the craft worker or in construction? How can we augment the future of work beyond just providing 3D information? And more importantly, how does this technology work in a complex project environment, whether it's a greenfield environment or a brownfield environment, a debottleneck in our plants? Regardless of where this information, there's no doubt that there's further information that can be gathered from engineering, these digitized engineering deliverables. For a lot of decades, we've been operating in the construction world that there's only a single consistent format providing those engineering deliverables to the craft worker. This team needs to challenge that paradigm. Closely related to that is our third stop, developing the next generation of field supervisors. Over the past 3 decades, we've seen a decline in the construction workforce and the availability of the craft worker. Along with that has came a decline in frontline supervisors. Now, there are a number of challenges when you try to increase the number of frontline supervision. There's no doubt that all of us in here know we require more of our frontline supervisors and our foremen in the field than ever before, whether that's from a safety process perspective or whether that's from an IT or technology advancement or simply just the way we do project controls and earn values and credits. They have to pay more attention. There's more work for them to do as a foreman in the field. So what are the challenges we face for our frontline supervision? What does that person look like in the future? Is there enhanced training that has to happen for that craft worker to be effective in the field, such as mobility, iPads, iPhones? We saw several presentations on that today. Increasing the diversity of our frontline supervision will also help improve our productivity as well. We have a number of underrepresented populations in our construction workforce that add value to our diversity, as well as providing that productivity and that way of thinking outside the box, as this team did as well. Our fourth stop, productivity culture. Since the early 1990s, I think we all can agree that safety has dramatically improved in the construction industry, in our industry. One of the major reasons behind that is the culture that we have developed regarding safety. Our personnel believe the same thing, have the same qualifications, have the same perceptions, have the same expectations for their personal safety as well as their colleagues' safety. We use titles like "we share because we care," so we can all go home safe. Zero mindset tolerances, posters, pre-job meetings, safety meetings. We start our meetings with a safety topic. Little has been done in the construction industry to produce the same type of culture for productivity. At the end of the day, no matter what kind of deliverable or whatever you provide for that craft worker, there's still a guy in the field that has to take a nut and a bolt and attach a flange, or to cut a piece of pipe, or to pull wire through a conduit. He's got to know that his work is important. He's got to know that in the culture that he works in, his work matters. Our last stop is craft competition. Now, there is no doubt that competition is a very highly motivated factor. My last 3 surgeries over the last 2 years have been a result of me competing in things that are not age appropriate for my age of 51. I've got a lot of titanium in this body and mesh. So whether you're competing in the gym or you're competing in the softball world or the basketball world or whatever you choose to do outside, there's no doubt that introducing competition in that arena improves that motivation. This proposed project on craft competition leverages knowledge of human factors that exist within behavioral sciences, help leverage craft competition. Now, this team is challenged. There's a caveat here with this team, because you don't want competition to drive inappropriate safety or quality. This team has a challenge to understand what the difference is and how you can commingle those two together. Gamification is one application. There's several gamers in here. I'm not a gamer. My kids are not gamers. And right now, my grandkids are not gamers. But if you look at gamification, they use leaderboards. They use point systems. They use interactive competition between people to improve what? The motivation to play the game. So we believe as a team that there's application for introducing a competition. Now, you got the part of the team that was going to have to figure out the basic metrics for that team. How do you compare a piping craft to an E&I or electrical craft? How do you compare a civil structural craft to the E&I craft? So there's a number of things that have to be developed in order to measure and monitor and to produce that competition. That's really simply the end of the roadmap. As Paul had expressed earlier, there's a number of other topics that the DCC-01 team came up with. I'd like to particularly thank these folks, these companies, these CII members. They dedicated some of their best and brightest talent to be a part of this team. Without that CII member research, this participation, this research would have never been possible. It says prepare for using live polling, but that didn't work real well last time, so I don't know. So, Click on poll number 2. I don't know if it's going to work or not. So which productivity topic interests you the most? Improving craft productivity by using data, the productivity culture, developing the next generation of field supervisor, or maybe there's another topic that you're interested in understanding more but from the research and the other 29 topics. And finally, as a call to action, I'd like to encourage each of you to find your best and brightest talent to become involved in these future research efforts. As I've already described, the program has started last fall with the launch of the DCC-04 team to incentivizing the use of advanced work packaging. It is our intent to relaunch other research teams based on this research as well. But it's still a debate in our industry. Has construction productivity really decreased? Has it increased? Or has it relatively been the same over the years? Regardless of which side of the fence you land on based on your own personal experience on the research data that's been provided, I think we all agree that we can improve. Because at the end of the day, it's important that those craft workers understand their work is important and that it matters.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have a few questions for you guys. I'm going to be on this side. And so the first one is, a lot has been discussed about long-term productivity declines in construction. How will this roadmap reverse this trend?
Well, it's a complicated question. And so I acknowledge that when you look at the decades of research in construction productivity, it does suggest that we have seen long-term declines. But I also think that when we look at some of the new data that comes out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and their productivity metrics, and they develop new productivity metrics for industrial construction, I think multifamily housing and single-family housing, one of the things they actually showed was that industrial productivity has actually been doing quite good and actually improving. And so I think that actually leaves credence in terms of looking at industry best practices in industrial construction is warranted. But to continue that growth, we also need to be looking outside the industry as well. And also, I think partly that we're seeing those new metrics suggesting that we're seeing actually some improvements in industrial productivity has been kind of going back to what we learned in the neuroscience field, is that we're finally getting better and more consistent data. And so I think it's actually a tribute to actually a lot of CII research that we've seen some of that productivity growth in construction, in industrial construction, because certainly not all the changes in the industrial construction sector can be attributed to everything within CII, but CII has certainly played a strong part, especially in the research on modularization, project scope definition, and so forth. Because I think there's also lessons learned that when you look at how industrial construction builds their project, they build them differently than the way we see it in highways and transportation and in commercial construction. So I think to answer that question, I think having the more consistent data and productivity metrics now, you can start to see if there are lessons learned in terms of transferring the improvements in one sector to other sectors of construction.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is the next good follow-up question. These are great ideas and insights about how other industries have improved their performance. What do you think would be the greatest challenge in construction in making them work?
I think for me personally, it comes down to the change. When you look at craft productivity, to me, it's about the craft worker. The productivity culture. We very rarely have conversations with our craft folks when it comes to productivity. That productivity conversation generally winds up being a whipping post about what you didn't get done or what you did wrong versus what we're focusing on today, what needs to be done, and here's how we get there to do that. So to me, it's implementation. To give you an example, when we introduced workplace planning at our particular site in Texas, it was a one-year journey for some of the craft workers that have literally grown up on that site for 30 years. They don't need it. They didn't need it. Now that those guys have been involved in the workplace planning for over 3 years, they accept it. They won't go to work without it now. So I think it's just that whole change, as Art talked about very timely this morning, that we have to get that to the craft worker. Okay.
I think I have one more for you guys, is how did you address how to measure productivity? Because we all do it differently. What was your approach?
You know, I think what I would go back to is the way, when we say improving productivity, we actually looked at many different metrics. Is it improving the output per work hour? Is it the time on tools? And we actually found out that, yeah, those two metrics were two of the more Scotty metrics based on other metrics like earned value, for example, and so forth. I think the industry has actually been wayward without actually having a good industry productivity metric. But I think that is now changing at the federal government level. And that the reason that's changing is because we are such a large industry. We're about 10 to 13% of the gross domestic product of the industry, of the nation's economy. And it's always been rather dramatic to me that we didn't actually have a strong industry productivity metric, but we do now. And so I think what we need to do is look at those metrics and now learn from them. All
right, very good. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your presentation, your contribution.